Our keynote speaker this morning is David Rothkopf, an expert in addressing difficult and seemingly intractable issues. So perhaps we can pick up a few tips from David. I'm counting on that, actually. The Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, a global think tank where David is a visiting scholar, lists his areas of expertise as follows. Listen to this. This is truly amazing. Emerging markets, global economic trends, economic market reform, economies in transition, international financial institutions, multinational corporations, trade policy, U.S.-China relations, NATO expansion, U.S.-Russia relations, globalization, international organizations, U.S. national security, use of force, terrorism, U.S. foreign policy, Latin America, Central Asia, and South Asia. Whew. Wow. I went back to my LinkedIn profile and I looked under expertise, and it says accounting. I need to change that. I'm totally embarrassed now at this point. David Rothkopf is also the president and editor-at-large of the FP Group, which is the division of the Washington Post company that publishes Foreign Policy magazine. He's also the president and CEO of Garton Rothkopf, an international advisory company based in Washington, D.C. In addition to the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, David is affiliated with a number of influential organizations, including the U.S. Institute of Peace, Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. He is the author of numerous books, writes a weekly column for Foreign Policy magazine, and is a regular contributor to leading newspapers and magazines. In addition to his role as a writer and a thinker, he has served as CEO of IntelliBridge Corporation, managing director of Kissinger Associates, and as both U.S. Deputy Undersecretary of Commerce for International Trade and acting Undersecretary during the Clinton administration. Please join me in welcoming David Rothkopf.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for that kind introduction. I'm a bit disoriented, not just because of that introduction. I can only say about that it proves one of my life's mottos, which is anything is possible if you're willing to be really superficial. I'm disoriented, of course, because I'm here in front of a great, energized group of people who have vision and leadership and a sense of equity and fair play, and I'm from Washington. And as you may know, Washington is broke. It's not just financially broke, it's broken, deep on the inside. We are having a debate in Washington today about a fiscal cliff, which was made up in Washington. A fierce debate about a few dollars here and a few dollars there that will essentially do nothing to address the underlying fiscal challenges faced by the United States. Whether it's 1.4 of this or 2.2 of that, the total fiscal and retirement health care unfunded liability debt of the United States is over $85 trillion. And we are talking about 1% of a percent. We are talking about the marginal issues. But of course, in today's world, talking about even just our fiscal issues doesn't address the core challenges that we face as a country. For a couple of hundred years, a formula has worked in the United States. For a couple of hundred years, we've grown in a certain way. When GDP went up, job creation went up, productivity went up, wages went up, social mobility went up, social inequity declined. For the past 10 years, for the first time in American history, that model stopped functioning. GDP went up, productivity went up, employment went down, median incomes went down, social mobility went down, and equality grew dramatically worse. And this is not just a political challenge for us or a social challenge for us. It's not even a macroeconomic challenge for us. It's a visceral, to the core, who are we, what are we about as a country challenge for us. And it's not that just because of terms of equity. It's that because if we fail to solve this problem, we will fail to lead, fail to grow, fail to play the role that we've played in the world for most of our adult lives and for most of American history. You know, 20 years ago, when I went into the Clinton administration, we saw a different world, and it was a moment of rather considerable hope. The Cold War, which had hung like a dark cloud over our heads, was ending. All of a sudden, we were in a period of euphoria. There were books published with ridiculous titles, like The End of History, which put forth ridiculous ideas, like we had solved all the problems of history, and from now on we would just be coasting and living on dividends. We thought that the fundamental debate of the preceding 200 years, a battle between a state-oriented system like communism and a market-oriented system like capitalism, had been resolved. Communism lost. The role of the state was clearly seen as inferior in society. It must be pushed aside. The American model, the Milton Friedman model, the Ronald Reagan model of how America should grow, which is laissez-faire and free markets, would triumph, and all the world would line up behind us. And we would lead, and they would follow, and that would be the story as we went forward. But the end of the competition between communism and capitalism did not produce that result. It produced something entirely different, which was a competition among competing versions of capitalism. There's a US version of capitalism that's facing certain kinds of challenges. And indeed, because of the factors that I just mentioned in terms of the past decade, because of growing inequality, because of a perception that our financial system is rigged, because of a perception that the rich get to pick who runs in an election, and the rich get to pick the outcomes that happen in these countries. The issues that were the divisive issues at the center of the last election campaign in the United States, we've lost credibility. We've lost credibility in global circles, and other models are gaining traction. We tend to minimize this here in the United States. But it's hard to minimize when you look at where the fastest growing countries in the world are. It's hard to minimize when you see China embracing a form of capitalism you might call capitalism with Chinese characteristics, where there is a big role for the state, and they are finding ways to compete, and they are growing rapidly, and next year, again, they will probably grow at something in excess of 9%. There's 70 cities of 1 million people in China. In 20 years, there will be 100 more of those cities. There will be 10 cities of 10 million or more. These are the people building those cities, who will be determining what a subway looks like and a power plant looks like and an electrical grid looks like, because they'll be writing the checks for it. China, that backwards country, is investing more in renewable energy than every other country in the world added up. And that's the Chinese model. Elsewhere in Asia, you find a Singaporean model, you might call it a small entrepreneurial state capitalism, where the state, no one would call Singapore a socialist environment, but the state plays a very big role, which they see as helping to ensure opportunity for everybody. There's India and Brazil with kind of development capitalism that has, takes into consideration that there are large populations on the way up. And then there's Europe. And we in the United States tend to look at Europe and in the past couple of years, write it off. In fact, when I was in the Clinton administration, I was in a meeting with a very senior official who will go nameless, but who lives in this vicinity, who said Europe is a museum. Everything that happened in Europe happened in the past. The jobs were created in the past. And because Europe's in crisis now, it was quite popular during the course of the past year to write off Europe and to say, this place is done. I don't know what happened to Mitt Romney in Europe. It was a bad thing, because clearly when he would go out on the campaign trail, when he really wanted to say where we didn't want to go, it was Europe. Watch out, or we'll become like Europe. Well, we could do worse, because Europe is not monolithic. And while Southern Europe is struggling, Northern Europe is doing exceptionally well. Some of the fastest growing economies in the world are in Northern Europe. And those economies look rather different. And they offer a different version of capitalism. And we wrote them off as socialist. We wrote them off. We said those economies don't make a difference in this world because there's too big a role for government. But we saw something different. We hit a wall in the economy. Our big auto companies were in trouble. What did we do? We had to have the government step in. Why did the government have to step in? It had to step in because there would have been a social catastrophe if GM and Chrysler had failed. There was no system underneath. There was no safety net. So we had to step in and keep that from happening. But an auto company in Sweden went bankrupt, Saab, and they didn't step in to bail it out. And the reason they didn't step in to bail it out is because there was a social safety net. And everybody in that company was going to be retrained. And they didn't worry about their pensions, and they didn't worry about their health care. And what was the consequence of that? They reinvented their economy. The market worked. Who's the better capitalist? The one that lets the failing company fail? Or the one that has to bail it out because otherwise you have social catastrophe? It's a different model, and it's a question worth asking. We, in the past election campaign, heard a lot about we must be number one. We must lead the world. But number one at what? The biggest GDP? The biggest military? After all, keep in mind, we collectively as a group have made a choice that the majority of the discretionary dollars that each of us want our government to spend will go to defense. Now, you may not have thought that, but that's what your government's been doing for 70 years. The majority of discretionary spending goes to defense. That's where we're investing, not education, not infrastructure, not research and development. We spend more on defense than the next 17 countries in the world added up. Most of them, however, are not our enemies. Most of them are our allies. In fact, we have no real declared enemies in that list. And yet we continue to do it even though we are broke. So we want to be number one in GDP, and we want to be number one in terms of defense. But in Northern Europe, these economies want to be number one in quality of life. And if you look at the quality of life metrics that exist, that look at length of life and education and happiness and health and so on and so forth, they lead the world. Now, you might say, well, of course they lead the world in those kind of things. They're socialists. They're spending money like crazy. They also lead the world in fiscal prudence and an investment in infrastructure and an investment in R&D. They see a different model. You know what else many of those countries lead the world in? The role of women in their societies. Norway, Sweden, the Netherlands, Iceland, Germany, they've blazed the trail. Most of those countries have quotas for women on boards. Now, in the United States, we hate to do that. We couldn't possibly think of doing that, even though the World Economic Forum says when you've got greater gender equality, you grow faster. Even though when a recent study showed that if the United States had women working in the marketplace to the same extent that it representing the same percentage of the population, we would grow 5% faster. Japan would grow 9% faster. Egypt would grow 34% faster if you had gender equity in an economic sense. But it's not just the Europeans that are recognizing that the role of women in their societies is a competitiveness issue. Do you know the place in the world that is the most recent to introduce a quota for women on boards? Dubai, this week. Do you know the next big place that's got women going onto boards in a quota by 2016? Malaysia. These are predominantly Islamic countries that have recognized that increasing the role of women in their society is not just an equity issue, it's a competitiveness issue. They're working in their self-interest to change what they can to compete better in a global environment that is not just competing capitalisms, but it's rising economies around the world, each embracing new models, each embracing new technologies. And they recognize you have to tap human potential. And the biggest untapped vein of potential on the planet Earth is not shale gas. It's not offshore oil. It's not some new technology. It's the majority population of the planet that is currently not employed or harnessed for its leadership or its vision in much the way that you as a group are advocating it be. That's the big hurdle of our time. The issue is not just an equity issue. It's not a social issue. It's not a political issue. It's a how do you lead in the 21st century issue. And that's profoundly important. We're not talking about that in Washington. In fact, this week we're celebrating that we now have a 20th woman senator out of 100. Now, as it happens, that's roughly the percentage of women in government that exist around the world. But there are a lot of countries with a different percentage. There are 10 countries in the world that are 40% or more women in their legislatures and government. About half of them, by the way, are some of those Northern European countries. But you want to know the country that leads the way the most? Rwanda. 56% women in government. Why? Because the men slaughtered themselves. And they had to rebuild. And they saw a different path forward. So it's not just women in business, it's women in government that are part of changing models. Of course, there are other things that are going on that are changing models. You know, we don't have big vertically integrated industries anymore in our society. We have to compete for a slice of a global supply chain. The models and the metrics that we use as a society don't work. If your business has a component where it must look at climate models, the climate models you're using are wrong. And as we enter a world of big data where we start slicing and dicing groups in different ways, borders will not define economies anymore. Economies will be defined in completely different ways. And to adapt to that world with new technologies and new competition and new models and new social makeups requires leadership like you find in this room and not leadership like we are burdened with in Washington. Not a leadership that is gazing inward intently at its own navel. Not leadership that bickers and says that that's principle. We, all of us, Americans, wherever we may be, have got to do what we can to shift the focus of that debate away from the false arguments that result from the inadequacies of our leaders and towards the big changes that we need to make to keep up with a world that is well ahead of us in looking for new models and embracing many of these things. And we celebrate ourselves as a country of innovators, even though many of the great innovations of our time have come from elsewhere. But because of places like Boston, places with great universities, there is enormous potential here that is going untapped and unlistened to in Washington. The National Intelligence Council just published a report the world through 2030. Nothing tells you about the present like the reports about the future it produces. That report was essentially an extrapolation of the situation that we find ourselves in today. When you look at those past reports, they didn't tap into the big global trends. And this is another problem with our system, and it's another problem many businesses face. Intellectual inertia is blocking us from seeing what's all around us. Now, it's breakfast. I don't want to depress you, which is why, by the way, I have not spoken much about foreign policy, broadly speaking. Yesterday was the luckiest day of Susan Rice's life. The cronyism that kept her from getting the job she deserved to get also kept her from getting a really lousy job. All of you should be thankful this morning as you leave this room that you will not be the next Secretary of State of the United States, although I'm sure many of you are qualified. But in that, this is breakfast, and I want to end on an up note, and I'm happy to take some questions on a variety of other things. Let me offer you with this one final positive note that came out of a conversation I just had here a moment ago. Washington is broken. That's a terrible thing, except that as Washington increasingly makes itself irrelevant, the rest of the United States finds another way to get ahead. States, localities, businesses, universities, individuals. Washington's not going to lead. But clearly, listening to you, reading this report, seeing the track record of this group, you are going to lead. And that's why I'll leave the breakfast optimistic and positive, because there is an alternative. And even though I must return home to Washington, it's primarily because my family is there. Thank you very much.
What a great talk. Questions? I can't imagine there aren't many questions. Right here.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation. My question is about the shifting demographics as you think about 2030 or 2080. There are some countries, well, continents, Africa, Middle East, large parts of the Middle East, to some extent Southeast Asia, where their populations are so young that average ages are in the 20s. And then you have the developed world where average ages are shifting up pretty dramatically. What do you see happening in that?
Well, I see a couple of things, some of which are expected and some of which are unexpected. First of all, we just did a foreign policy conference last week, Hillary Clinton, Tom Donilon, a bunch of admirals and generals and others talking about the future of the world. The single most frequently quoted factoid at that conference was 7 of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world are in Africa. So that says something about the energy of those young people. The second thing I'd say about it is I was hopeful in the wake of the Arab Spring, not just because the fact that it might have stirred up some democratic impulses in the region, which I'm not sure are going to actually take, but because it would make people realize that the greatest challenge in the Middle East is employing young people. Now, and particularly in the Middle East, at this moment, it's employing young men. I spoke to the National Security Advisor of Jordan. He said, our stability and future depends on 6 to 7 million jobs, that it's harnessing those populations. And so it's a national security issue. And I'll just give you one other demographic point there. I keep reading studies that say, woe is me, America's getting older. We have this big gray wave coming. In Europe, they talk about a pensioner bulge, which I struggle to fight every day. I don't think they understand how human history works. 100 years ago, the average life expectancy in the United States at the beginning of the 20th century was 46. Some of us would no longer be with you. Now, we are approaching a time when it's, almost twice that. People worked in heavy jobs in the field and in factories until they were, 40 or 50, and then they died. Now they work until they're 65 or 66 or 67. Obviously, all of these people in a world where you don't have to lift bales of hay have a huge contribution that they can make to the economy. Just as harnessing women in the economy will produce economic growth, so will enabling people who are older and have experience enable the economy to grow even further. We are going to harness the gray wave. We're going to tap into it as an economic force. We're going to have to come up with new models because our system's not going to be able to pay for people. Remember, Social Security was created, the whole concept of this pension system was created by Bismarck when the average life expectancy was under the 65-year-old retirement age. Now it's 77 or 78 years old. So we have to reinvent. We haven't done it yet. But there is another very promising demographic boom, and that is related to the fact that all of us are going to be around much longer. And I think we should see the positive of that because we really don't have any choice.
There are microphones if you have questions. Here?
Hi. I was curious if you could comment about fiscal policy in Europe versus the United States, and specifically about the idea of getting out of a recession either by spending or really reducing debt. And the unemployment currently in Europe is really high. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are long term about how they've decided to deal with the fiscal crisis.
Okay. Well, first of all, unemployment in Southern Europe is very high, in some places shockingly high. In Northern Europe, it's not quite as high. Clearly, countries need to fix their fiscal problems, and we need to fix our fiscal problem. But we should also remember that we have to keep growing, and the best way to fix fiscal problems is to have economic growth and use the revenues that produces. And so you need a balance, and that's what the IMF has been saying under Christine Lagarde. We need a balance between finding the stimulus. If you stop providing the stimulus into the economy, then you will not get what you need to ultimately get out of this hole. And I think that that's true in the United States as well. If we just shut everything down right now, it's going to cause big problems. I should add, though, that it's not just fiscal policy that's causing some of the imbalances in the world. The three biggest economies in the world are all gaming the system by artificially devaluing their currencies. The Europeans do it by having Northern Europeans that export a lot devalue the euro by attaching themselves to Southern Europeans who pull down the value of the euro. The Chinese do it with subsidies and with rigging the system, and we do it with quantitative easing. And so in order to get rid of some of the imbalances that are producing drag in the economy, we also have to address these things. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, something near and dear to all of our hearts, I think, is CEO pay. And can you talk a little bit about the inequalities in the United States relative to other countries? Our CEO pays are a pretty sad fact. It's like 475 to 1 to the average worker, which is, does not compare to any other country in the world. Can you talk a little bit about that and what that creates in an economy?
Well, first of all, you said it pretty well. The ancient Romans were not known with their obsession with the equality. Roman generals made something like 60 times as much as Roman foot soldiers. US CEOs in the 70s made something like 35 times as much as regular employees. Today we're approaching 500 times as much. It's insane. It's wrong. It produces social backlash. It feeds into inequality. You know, in the period since the recovery, 90+% of the benefits of the recovery have gone to the top 1% of the population in the United States. The 10% remaining, and it's actually 7%, it was 93%, the table scraps go to the rest of us. Now, I don't care whether you're Democrat or Republican. That's formula for social disaster. It's compounded by the fact that the majority of minority students in inner city schools don't graduate high school. That we are cutting back on programs that help them to do that. So the bottom falls farther and farther behind, and the top goes faster and faster forward. And the recent financial crisis did nothing to slow it. The recent election did nothing to slow it. Both political parties are in this and have been co-opted by money. No one raised more money ever prior to 2008 than Barack Obama. He got most of his money from Wall Street. He was the one who got off of the federal matching program and changed the paradigm. This past year, the Republicans caught up. You know, we're now having a big debate in Washington over whether Anna Wintour should be the next ambassador to the United Kingdom. Seriously. Because she raised a lot of money. If you think there's no connection between having a political system corrupted by money and having growing inequality in the United States, then afterwards we can all gather around this table and I will read you a fairy tale. Yes, ma'am. On the left, over here.
Hi, David.
Hi.
My name is Jean Patel-Bushnell, and I'm on the Strategic Planning Committee of the Boston Club. And just recently, we were having a discussion about some of the industries that our members work in that are predominantly male. And we were talking about the fact that the men who seem to embrace women's leadership and who seem to propel women to high levels of growth and development seem to have women in their own families who are highly qualified and are leading, such as grandmothers, wives, daughters. Might you share with us, from a bit of levity standpoint, who have been the iconic leaders as women who have propelled you to such a rich understanding of the power of women? And if you would share this, I think it would be rather enlightening for all of us.
Well, I don't know whether it will produce levity or it'll just be a sad, sad story. I'm clearly at the bottom of the intellectual food chain in my family. You know, my nuclear family consists of two very smart daughters and one very smart wife. And, you know, all of them are doing great things. And, you know, so that's part of it. My mother is 83 years old, and she lives in New Jersey, sorry to say. And she just published a 3-volume history of exchange of letters between two British poets in the 20th century. So, you know, what I've learned by hanging around with women like this is to just do what I'm told.
I hate to ask this question because it's returning to the gloom and doom, and for that I apologize. You've spoken of the diminished credibility of the United States globally. Given that the fiscal cliff was an artificial construction, if in fact we do go over this cliff, even for a few days, what will be the impact on how the United States is perceived among world powers? To what extent are they at all fixated on this the way we are?
Well, let me answer with a question. If Lindsay Lohan were arrested again tomorrow morning, how would your opinion of her change?
Perfect. I wouldn't go any further.
Thank you very much for your words, but there was one word that you said several times, and that word was compete. And if I think about the playground, the boys are chasing the boys, and the girls find a rope, and it takes 3, one at each end and one in the middle. So when you describe that we need more women in business, it is not to compete, it is to collaborate.
Well, I appreciate that that's the case. I wrote a book a couple of years ago called Superclass, and the book the book looked at the rise of this sort of global leadership class that was doing better than everybody, billionaires and people running companies, and whether they were what kind of impact having a group like that was having on the planet socially and politically. In the context of doing the book, it became very clear to me early on that the most underrepresented group in this global superclass was women. And so I went and I spoke to a lot of women who were CEOs or at senior levels in government. And while many of them would say things like what you said, when I probed them further, many of them said, I haven't done much to help other women. I got here on my own. I'm not, that's not my job. Women have got to make it by men's rules, et cetera, et cetera. Now, that's clearly not the ethos of this group. But I want to say that the ethos of this group is not the ethos of all women leaders in business everywhere. Nor is it the ethos of a lot of women leaders in politics. And so your point is well taken, and I think, frankly, men could learn. Men are capable of collaboration, too. Lenin and McCartney, well, that didn't turn out so well. But the point is, men are capable of collaboration as well, and we ought to aspire to that standard. But don't by any means get, confused by being in a group of collaborators that the rest of the world or the rest of women leaders are acting in the same way. Yes?
Hi, I'm Donna Abelli. I'm chairman of the board of Rockland Trust One, as I think you were an unbelievably fantastic speaker, and I thank you. I'm asking you a personal belief of will there ever be, and in what year will there be, a woman president of the United States?
2016. I believe that's what's going to happen. I mean, a lot of things can happen, a lot of things can go wrong. Hillary Clinton was robbed in 2008. She was robbed by fellow Democrats. She was robbed of the opportunity and had to fight a different kind of battle on her way to the thing. She responded to it with extraordinary class and leadership, has been one of the great secretaries of state that the United States has had, and I've written a history of the foreign policy community since the Second World War, and she is certainly in the first rank of secretaries of state that we have had in the course of that period. I had her at this conference last week, and she spoke, and she was presented with questions on the world, and in each one, she knew her brief and responded in 5-minute answers with real specifics. She's a dazzling competent, capable person, and also happens to be the most popular politician in the United States of America right now. So there is absolutely no reason why she shouldn't be, unless the Republican Party can find a woman of equal standing to run against her. And I don't mean Chris Christie.
Thank you. Ooh. Thank you so much. I just have a perplexing question concerning Sweden, Norway, and Iceland. I just don't understand why the models, they've been historically so successful for so long. I understand socialism. And I get into discussions trying to support the argument, but I guess I'm not equipped to do so. Can you help me understand how we can translate that model into a more, utility here in America? If it's not going to be socialism, let's be creative, call it something else, and let's deploy retraining. Let's support education. Can you help me with that?
Well, I might be able to help you. I don't know if we will be able to help the rest of the United States with that. Sweden has reinvented itself many times over the years. In fact, in the last book I wrote, which was on sort of the rise of companies, I point out that the oldest company in the world that's still in existence was born 1,000 years ago in Sweden, when a goat wandered away from its goat herd, returned with red horns, and the goat herd went to find the red horns and discovered a vein of copper and built a copper company called Stora Kopparberg, which today is called Stora Enso. It's a big paper company, which is bigger in terms of its annual sales than about 60 countries on the planet. No one's heard of it, which was my point, that you have big companies out there. So Sweden was the birthplace of modern corporations, among other things, and has seen many other developments there, as these other countries have. Iceland and Sweden and Norway all had these gatherings of people, which were, of tribes, which were called things. Strangely enough, the word thing actually initially referred to a gathering like this one, except everybody had clubs. I hope you don't have clubs, or leave by the back exit. But and the person who presided over that gathering would sit on a rock, and he would speak the laws that had been agreed to in the last such gathering, and that person became the speaker of the thing. And the Speaker of the House that we have is the name, the title, and the job comes from those early polities. It doesn't come from Greece as we thought about it. A lot of the structure of democracy that we use came out of the North and not out of the South in Europe. So that's another strain in it. But Sweden went too far with its system, and its banking system blew up in the early 90s, and they retooled it so that it was actually much more prudently run, so that when the last crisis happened, we ended up looking to them as a model. What I would suggest that we in the United States do is do what each of you do in your business. Look for what's working. A lot of what's working elsewhere, lifelong education, quotas for women on boards, efforts to create more diversity in government leadership, investing in research, recognizing that countries play a role in determining the infrastructure that helps people compete. All those things are being done better someplace else. So whether it's Sweden or Norway or Iceland or Singapore or the United Arab Emirates or Israel or Brazil, there are lessons to be learned out there. And if we can do one thing as Americans, it's we can get over ourselves and recognize that this is a country that was built by people coming from someplace else, bringing with them ideas from someplace else. And we can go and seek ideas from the whole planet in the same way that those ideas have fed our growth over the course of the past 200 years.
One more question?
Up one or two, whatever you want.
One more question. Right here.
Well, he kind of pretty much explained what I was going to ask, but I am going to ask it anyways.
Well, I'll just repeat my question.
You said, look for what is working. Why is it so hard for Washington to see and actually work with what is working within us, within what they're seeing outside of the USA. What's the biggest hurdle for Washington to make final decisions that are so, I mean, your speech was so easy to follow.
Well, I'm from New Jersey.
And when I see the economy the way it is, I just don't understand. I mean, do they need a woman to say, snap out of it?
Surely we do. But, you know, I've, in addition to working in government, writing stuff, I've run some businesses. And very early on, I learned an important lesson in one business would be, we'd sit in a room and a guy would say, why is the client buying our products? And some bright, shiny-faced salesperson would say, because it's better? And the guy would go, no. And then somebody would say, because it's cheaper? And the guy would go, no. And he'd say, because I'm a better salesperson and I have a nice brush? And the guy would go, no. He said, people buy products to get promoted. People buy products to advance their own careers. People judge things in terms of their self-interest. Washington isn't working for America, but it's working just fine for the guys in Washington. They have their jobs, they have positions, they've got cars, they fly on planes that say United States of America. Obviously, they have influence even over microphones far, far away. But the system is working for them. When they leave, they get rich. They write books, they go into companies. You hire them, you give them big salaries. Only when the system stops working for the people in the system will there be change. Only when you demand that they address inequality, only when you demand that they address competitiveness, only when you demand that they say, no, we can't have a campaign finance system unlike any other in the world that requires billions of dollars, that lets millionaires pick who the candidates are because if they can't raise the money, they don't get to be in the race. Only when you say, you know, we can't have a system where in the 1970s, the filibuster rule was invoked in the Senate 8% of the time, and now it's invoked 80% of the time, which gives the requirement of a supermajority all the time and gives individual senators more power, where an individual senator like John McCain can say, look, I'm going to block this candidate. That's not in the Constitution. The filibuster rule is not in the Constitution. Citizens United aside, the right of rich people to choose who our candidates are is not in the Constitution. I guess this is the place to stop, but the point is that the system is not working for us, but it's working for them, and it's up to us to change that. Thank you very much.